If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Deviant the Renegades as I present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the game for you. When I started doing the Law by Night podcast, doing book reviews wasn't something I immediately considered. I didn't really have much of a collection at the time, nor was I all that knowledgeable on the lore and setting, so I didn't really have much of a leg to stand on at the time when I came to do my critiques. More importantly, I had little experience playing games, let alone running them. I didn't know much outside Vampire the Masquerade and the World of Darkness, and yet I find myself with a core book of the latest game found within the Chronicles of Darkness franchise, which has nothing to do with any of those things. I had, on a few occasions, said I wasn't planning on covering Chronicles of Darkness material on the podcast, so what's up with that? Well, in late 2021, a troublesome individual had got me curious about their favourite Chronicles of Darkness game, Changeling the Lost, which I won't cover for now, other than it is significantly more appealing to me than Changeling the Dreaming. This was a teeny gateway into the Chronicles of Darkness, and I started to poke around on DriveThruRPG and found this game, Deviant the Renegades, a storytelling game of vengeance, to quote the book's subtitle. I also had my eye on the second edition of Hunter the Vigil, which honestly looked a lot more interesting than Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition. What acted as a catalyst for me purchasing the book was a tweet done by the Onyx Path Twitter page that was advertising to content creators, STs and the like to appear on their Twitch channel to run and talk about their games. I was hesitant to apply to run one of their games, but with a friendly push and encouragement from friend and Law by Night Discord server mod Charizard, I applied. Then, 3 days later, on the 7th of January 2022, I start communicating with Travis Ledge from Onyx Path, and I found myself running my first Chronicles of Darkness game on the Onyx Path Twitch channel for a trio of individuals, one of which being one of Deviant's authors, so there was absolutely no pressure whatsoever. This one-shot took place on the 26th of March 2022, exactly a month ago as of the writing of the script, so I've had a lot of time to mull over my thoughts and opinions regarding this book. I have briefly talked about it on Twitter, but now I ask you to join me in what is the first recorded audio review of Deviant the Renegades online, where we will work out together whether it's worth buying the currently latest installment in the Chronicles of Darkness franchise, or should you avoid this edgy take on the X-Men. But before we do that, here are the rules for the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and how easy they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I've said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you're right and I am wrong and vice versa. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book made out of that slightly squishy cardboard material, meaning it will mark easily. The most noticeable of these are found along the top corners of the book, and because I've used my copy a lot, one can see the bends in the plastic film that envelopes the cover, most notably across the spine of the book. This does not bother me too much, but I know that sort of thing will annoy some people. My solution to this is to purchase a PDF copy. Regardless whether you choose to purchase a physical or digital copy, you will find that the quality of the artwork and the book itself just pops beautifully. Chronicles of Darkness books are interesting when compared to other tabletop role-playing game books in that they all stick to a small collection of colours and shades. The Chronicles of Darkness core book, for example, uses navy and washed-out blues. Changeling the Lost adopts different light and dark greens, whereas Deviant the Renegade adopts a collection of reds. At first, I wasn't too sure about this direction, as I was unconvinced whether you could capture a game's entire mood with a single colour. This is probably why I'm not an art director, for I was very narrow-minded. Each portrait, scene, and full-page spread has uniquely monstrous people whose beings have been ruined and altered by science. The reds and deep purples really give the sense of this deep, rotted, hateful sadness, angry at what they have become through those that have made them, and sad that there is little they can do about it, beyond the initial game's themes of seeking vengeance on those who have done them wrong, whilst holding on onto their crumbling humanity. The front and back covers of the book are particularly striking, which are collage pieces of other pieces found within the main book. All the ones here are done by the fantastic Samuel Aria, whose dark horror art is appropriately visually striking. The hideous entity on page 217 and the scene depicted on page 61 are personal favourites of mine. Otherwise, much of the artwork are scenes of various deviants engaged in hectic combat. The art style in most of the instances is something I would associate with graphic novels, which I don't think is offensive here. It also pleases me greatly that throughout the book we see individuals of all shapes, sizes and colours, making the book and the world of Deviant itself feel alive and believable. There are also inclusions of disabled people, such as on pages 26, 31 and 222, and people of non-Western faiths, such as the person on page 36. These people feel alive and are not just depictions of them, all of which I find very inspiring and we can all learn from. Such small inclusions speak volumes about the authors involved with the creation and publishing of this book. When you open the book and read the first part of a sad and tragic tale found within the book, you are greeted with an introductory chapter that details the themes of the book and what it will cover inside. Listeners of the podcast who partake in World of Darkness material exclusively shouldn't feel too alienated with this chapter. Both Chronicles and World of Darkness create games of dark, personal horror, where mortals are unaware of the supernaturals that go bump in the night or prowl the streets at twilight, and a whole bunch of other things in pursuit of power. Deviant is somewhat different to these ideas, as this game is focused on the mortals and companies known as conspiracies that have taken you for some reason, a reason determined by you and the storyteller. These conspiracies, whether it be in a small or large company or cult, abused your trust and did something or some things only to empower themselves for their own gains. Something went wrong, breaking your soul and causing a divergence to occur as you border the line between supernatural and human in how you behave and look. You manage to escape from your makers, your progenitors, and the rest of the game follows where you and your cohort of deviants have gone renegade, wanting to fight back and fuck up some assholes as you come to terms with your new existence, hiding from the public whilst also trying to uphold your crumbling humanity. You do this with powers known as variations, each one having a dangerous cost called a scar, putting the famous metaphor "with great power comes great responsibility" into a harrowing light that tells the player it is not just a game of vengeance, but one of trauma, abuse, and disability, which is something I thought I would never find myself talking about in a book like this. I will explore this later in this review. The introduction chapter also outlined the devoted that undergo similar experiments as the Renegades, the player characters, but are blindly loyal to said conspiracies, and all the ones that interlock with each other, known in-game as the Web of Pain. Listeners of the podcast that dabble in the occasional Chronicles of Darkness might be a little bit confused by the use of conspiracy here, as they may immediately think of the conspiracies that make up the larger optional playable factions in the Hunt of the Vigil franchise, and I just described to you, these are not necessarily the same conspiracies. The chapter concludes with an outline of each chapter, its moods and themes, what exactly is a storytelling game, a handy lexicon, as well as a plethora of inspirational materials, as one may be used to with any Chronicles of Darkness game and any pre-5th edition of World of Darkness book. The one addition to the latter that made me smile was the inclusion of a video game section, the one singular game being BioShock, which made a lot of sense, as well as showing that the team are modern enough to include video games as sources of inspiration. As a fellow game enthusiast, I think that makes the writers pretty cool folks. The first chapter of the book wastes no time in giving the players exactly what they want, which is the type of deviants you'll be playing in your Deviant the Renegades Chronicles. It is not as straightforward as that, of course, for the chapter reinforces once more that your character is naturally not part of the world, that some group of people did things to you, even to go as far as address you, the reader, in the second person, making you feel the character is an extension of you, which I suppose all TTRPGs TTRPG characters we create are. Deviants have an origin and a clade assigned to them. Origin is, well, how we entered the conspiracy, but more interestingly, describes the nature of the divergence and how the remade the deviant feels towards it. Clade, on the other hand, is the rough characterization of a deviant by divergence, process, and variation type. In less confusing TTRPG parlance, Origins would be your character's race, whilst Clade is the character class. Each of these have layouts and presentations that, again, fans of Chronicles and World of Darkness before it would recognize, a short description of what they are, nicknames, and, unlike World of Darkness, the sorts of people that would make up each Origin and Clade, and a few character concept ideas, presented as short and neat fictions. They each have their own symbols as per Chronicles and World of Darkness tradition. The Origin symbols are more impressive than the magic rune inspired ones of the Clades. I do feel it is worth pointing out just exactly what the Origins and Clades are in this book, as the game is a lot newer as of the writing and recording of this episode, and I think it would be more beneficial to briefly go over them than it would do in something more popular like Vampire the Masquerade. The Origins presented in the core book are Autojuric, or the Elect, willingly sought out divergence as their primary goal. Epimorph, or the Volunteers, agreed to be remade out of necessity or empty promises. Exomorph, or the Unwilling, were forced into divergence through kidnapping or threat. Genotypals are born into their divergence. They were either born the way they were, or their divergences occurred as they grew up. And pathological are accidents. They became one of the remade, not by any intentional action, but by sheer happenstance. As for the Clades presented in the core book, you have the Cephalists, who are psychics, whose divergence unlocked the power of the mind to new and inhuman possibilities, granting supernatural focus and influence. Chimerics are hybrids that were merged somehow with another life form, be it with some sort of plant or animal. Coactives are deviants infused with intangible energy, absorbing and challenging it in some form. Invasives are implanted with foreign inanimate matter. On the surface, that makes them sound like traditional cyborgs, but not all invasives have mechanical or technological additions. This section makes it clear they could be some mystical artifact or parasitic organism that caused the divergence. And finally, you have the Mutants, or Grotesques, as they are so nicknamed, are deviants whose bodies rejected the divergence but changed them into something all of its own. Each Origin and Clade I feel captures so many distinct flavours in modern horror, particularly if you love sci-fi and body horror, themes that don't immediately leap out when talking about these TTRPGs. If I was to make one criticism about this section, is that I would have liked to have seen some more adventurous Origins as well as these. It's a small nag, but only because I love what we currently have and would love to have more. If I were to choose a favourite Origin and Clade, I would have to pick Epimorph, or the Genotypal Origin, and the Chimeric Clade. Chapter 2 is the fairly large setting chapter that expands upon why and how Deviant's conspiracies do what they do, in addition to hiding and clearing up the mess that is the Renegades, so to speak, including but not limited to Ferals, Deviants whose looks and powers are widely out of control, Manticores, which are essentially animals that have gone through similar transformations, which is a purchasable merit in character creation too. Conspiracies can also use guards, hunters, spies, lots of money, and much more. Ideas on how the divergence occurs are presented, as well as the variations that occur from that, emphasizing that engineering these things is remarkably difficult. For the most part, these are all very unhappy accidents, and the only ones who benefit are the ones pulling the strings from the shadows. The chapter also talks in great detail how a renegade might survive out in the open, for they don't exactly fit in anymore, knowing full well they are fiends of ridicule and abuse just because of how they look. Many turn to crime, but all have to live off the grid somehow, away from frightened eyes, relying on a small pool of contacts and their personal touchstones, which may not always be a person. Despite what renegades can physically do, they are very much at the bottom of the pecking order of the social ladder. It is depressing and harrowing to read and take in. You are not a vampire that can climb to the top, or a werewolf that can shift in and out of its wolf form. You are hideous tedious, and you are stuck like that, destined only to get worse over time, as will the outlook of society in due course. I suspect that sentiment rings very true to a lot of listeners to the podcast. The following chapter is the chapter that focuses on the Renegades themselves, starting with the character creation process. It is a very involved section of the book, forcing the players and ST to work together, as the amount of dots you can distribute in variations and scars, as well as the overall threat level of the conspiracy, which encourages the cohort and reason to band together, even if they come from different sources and are not friends, which I feel was a trope too many groups fall into when designing their characters. I am fond of Deviant conspiracies being treated as its own character, much like the atmosphere and/or weather in a horror film or a ship in a pirate or sci-fi film. This chapter, I believe, is a poorly organised one, as it throws all the stats and mechanics that aren't just storyteller related at you, teaching how to make instability, forms for your character, touchstones, making devoted characters, how beats help to accumulate experience points, the large list of merits, and much more. With exception to the merits, I do believe that a lot of this chapter could have benefited from existing as part of Chapter 4, the following chapter, or even one of its own right, and being a much smaller one, letting character creation, merits, beats, and experiences, and the variations and scars exist as one. And on the mentioning of variations and scars, I shan't deny that the character creation process for Deviant is overly complicated because of this section, which is a pretty large portion of a huge chapter. Assigning attributes and skills, specialties and merits is what my nan would call a piece of piss, and thinking about the distribution of touchstones and convictions is an interesting yet enjoyable challenge, but what is actually meant to be the fun stuff, the assigning of powers and drawbacks, the variation and scars, is a process I personally find very tedious and confusing, trying to work out how many dots I could put in certain variations and making sure they don't exceed a certain number, whilst making sure the ones from Origin had this much and so forth. I think the Hatties here and Syrinx can attest to the trauma it induced trying to work this shit out, so I'm very grateful for Jacqueline Brick, the other player and author I spoke of earlier, for saving our dumb asses. However, whilst it fails at simplicity, it totally makes up for both in quality and quantity, as each clade has a variety of variations, as well as a whole host of more general ones, not letting clades get in the way of what you want to do. The gigantic variation for a chimeric character might be a large Venus flytrap, whereas the invasive could be a Megazord-inspired design that shoots lasers from its nipples. The freedom is nearly endless. The limiting factor is the plenty of controlled, involuntary, and persistent scars for anyone to pick and choose from. For example, our Tiddy Megazord gigantic variation may be married with the cooldown scar to represent the machine elements within. For the flytrap, they could have the preparation scar to show the plant person actually growing. It's a section in the book that I love and hate so much. At least there are some handy reference tables at the end of the chapter to make things a little easier. That said, if you need a table like that, you have given folks too much or presented it poorly and needed to do a quick fix. Chapter 4 talks about the Chronicles of Darkness version of the storyteller system, which is mostly similar to those who are familiar with any World of Darkness game, taking a bit from the old and a bit from V5 stuff, though you could argue that V5 just copied a lot of Requiem's homework. Anywho, I'll make two comments, one positive and one negative. As someone who is brand new to the Chronicles of Darkness as of the recording of this script, I should comment on how I find the general rules of Deviant's takes on the Chronicles of Darkness. Playing it is a fucking breeze. The use of willpower is interesting, and I like the concept of the 10 again ruling, as well as the concept behind tilts and conditions, which are kinda like status effects. Some are permanent, or some have to be restored/removed in a particular way, and some disappear after combat. Often in TTRPGs we pretend our characters are ill or injured, and in World of Darkness games I've rarely seen folks properly portray being spooked or being knocked down, but with a mechanic in place to enforce that, it is simply ingenious. Even if some of them could have been construed as insensitive, they, alongside equipment, armour and the like, are found at the back of the book in the form of two appendices. What I am not so keen on is the half-assed inclusion of virtues and vices, which serve as anchors for mortal characters, but the list of them is not in this book, but in the Chronicles of Darkness core book, which I find rather irritating. I have no problem with books referencing each other in the form of clever Easter eggs that make the reader feel clever and inspired by and working out a bit of cheeky lore, but to do so to force players to buy additional books for the full experience is rather cheeky at best and greedy at worst. Antagonists make up the 5th chapter of the book, starting with the conspiracies and their many forms: governments, cults, high societies, or even just criminal organizations, before talking about their methodologies once more, and then the conspiracy creation process. Whilst it does not have its own character sheet, everything else about it is treated as such, something I really like, as I mentioned previously. Whilst it has its own mechanics and systems to span many pages, it is generally really a useful way for the storyteller to adjust the gameplay based on the player's actions. Whilst more experienced STs would probably keep a tab on these things anyway, seeing this brought forward as a must-do is a rather helpful thing for newer STs, be it for the Chronicles of Darkness or to TTRPGs as a whole. The chapter also has altered character creation for the Devoted and Nemesis, which are like the Devoted but extra and angry, as well as some example characters for Deviant, Manticore, and Mortal Foe alike. Armed with baddies galore, one would require a place to put them, and Chapter 6 is kind of, but not really, the chapter for that. What this chapter provides is a variety of different settings from across the world that STs can drop their players in. Each of the locations are beautifully crafted with lots of information for the reader to use, but not too much that every element is dictated to you. There is enough wiggle room for imagination, so you could insert your own characters here if you so choose. Beyond this, there's not really a set lore for Deviant, which I'm totally happy with. I know, the Lore by Night podcast guy saying he's happy with the lack of lore. What is going on? Well, it's because Deviant had set itself apart from the other splats with its direction from the get-go. It wasn't trying to lie or pull the rug from underneath the reader and upset its fanbase. Now, if future books do and try and establish some lore, I will no doubt begin to approach that in due course. The final chapter is my favourite chapter in the book, which long-time listeners of the podcast can probably guess what this chapter entails. For those that can't, it is the storytelling chapter, and I am honestly blown away with just how much information is presented to the readers. Both sides of revenge is explored, safety and consent during play also, more advice on running the conspiracies, dealing with body horror and violence that comes with a game as visceral as Deviant, as well as expanding the themes of isolation, all of which is handled with intense respect and care. But that is not all that it covers, which admittedly is rather a lot. Abuse and microaggressions are constant themes, reminding the reader how different the remade are, and how different in the eyes of most is something to fear and hate. You can argue with me on that take if you wish, and as much as I don't want this to be true, it very much is. Usually in my book reviews, themes of mental health, trauma, ableism and abuse would be things I would complain about because of how poorly they have been handled. I would get angry and frustrated at the lack of care and nuance taken to properly research abuse, disability and neurodivergence, or ND, how authors claim their way is the right way, rather than taking the time of hiring folks who have lived through the experiences you wish to depict in your works, or at the very least, hire a pool of sensitivity readers. Even if you know what you're talking about, it is always worthwhile to get a second, third and fourth opinion. I know for a fact that everyone who worked on Deviant the Renegades have experienced some form of these themes. The degrading sexism of being told to smile more because it makes you feel pretty, the frustrating anger of being disabled, the shame endured from abuse, and the trauma that follows is terrifying. It was something Jacqueline shared with me before the one-shot I did, but to be honest, dear listener, it was a confirmation I really didn't need, because it was very clear in everything I read in this book that the team had gone through some shit. Many have taken this game as an edgy hack-and-slash splat within the Chronicles of Darkness, whilst Dixie Crocken of Onyx Path described Deviant once as techno-changeling. I suppose on the surface both these descriptors are right, perhaps the latter being the closest, but I feel Deviant is much more than a sci-fi bloodfest or Fae but with science. To me, Deviant the Renegades is a game that allows players and storytellers near endless possibilities to play their failed science experiment of an anti-hero, seeking out some warped sense of justice, what many call revenge or vengeance. What fuels those motivations is the abuse of trust, neglect, the frustrations of constantly being ostracized, and the fury of time and time again not being able to fit in with everyone else and being in constant pain and agony for something you did not ask or want for. Series of defects that will only worsen with time. It is about overcoming your internalized ableism, facing your traumas, and spitting them in the eye, not letting your abusers limit your value in life. These are very specific things that the large minority of people experience every single day. Some lesser folks will complain that I've just made it political. No, what I have done is gotten you to think about things that don't usually apply to you, just like this book has done. I am disabled, I am autistic, and already half of the listeners hate my guts because I exist. I have gone through trauma, I have survived abuse, and I am no stranger to the cold, hot fear that self-inflicted body horror can bring. The world is ruled by neurotypical or NT people, i.e. the normies, who don't display neurodivergent behaviours. Our media is predominantly NT things for MT people, and I have always found it very hard to connect with most characters in fiction because fewer are autistic and even fewer are disabled. Few things in media manage to convince me that folks genuinely care about mental health and disability. So when I say I was crying my eyes out at the very end of chapter 7 because of the harrowing yet cathartic experience of feeling seen with such transparent yet detailed writing, I fucking mean it. From the bottom of the cold, dank void with my heart should be, I thank all the authors for creating this morbid yet exciting game with the respect that you have all done. As for the listeners of the podcast, I desperately implore you all to purchase this book and experience this game. For the clusterfuck that is the character creation process that may daunt those new to the Chronicles of Darkness setting, it is a small but noticeable blip in an otherwise fantastic piece of gaming material that I truly hope stands the test of time. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book Native Environment out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VDM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.